How would you describe the Fringe to someone who hasn't seen it?
It's an open invite theater festival where the focus is on original, experimental, and yet accessible theater. There's no advantage if someone's a man or a woman. I think the only level playing field is for gender in theater that I know of. You don't have to have a reputation within the theater world at large. It doesn't hurt, but you don't have to. If you're doing a play that's unpublished, that's no disadvantage. If you're doing a play that only has one person or has no set, that's no disadvantage. Whereas if you're doing something that's never been done, that's actually an advantage. You know, people want to be surprised. They want you to play with them. Theater audiences in the Fringe are pretty savvy. They like you to play with them. They like you to show them something new. They like to have you interact with them. It's experimental theater, but not if it's too experimental, no one's going to want to see it. Because the actors are only making what their box offices. So the actors are kind of reined in by the fact that if you go too far, if you go beyond what people want to see, then you're just not going to make any money. It may be artistically satisfying for you, but you're going to be broke and you're going to starve.
How long have you been doing this, TJ?
I did my first Fringe tour in 1994, so I was 19, I turned 20 on that tour, and I just finished my second year at UVic as a theater student, and I auditioned for somebody else's play, which was Never Swim Alone by Daniel McIver. We did 5 Fringes, Toronto, Winnipeg, Saskatoon, Edmonton, Victoria. And then I finished my theater degree, which took another 2.5 years, and then I started touring the Fringe after that. So I did my first full all across Canada tour in 1998 with my own stuff, and I've done it pretty much every summer since.
In '98, you said that was the first time you did it with your own stuff.
Yeah.
What was that experience like?
It was an epic adventure, but it was also really difficult because in Fringes you pay an application fee that's about $500 per city, and in a number of cities I didn't even make that back.
Yeah.
You know, and the media had never heard me, and the staff had never heard me, and the volunteers had, and the audiences had never heard me. So even though the show itself was good, it took a long time. It was a long, slow build in every city before I'd finally have like one good audience at the end of the festival, and sometimes I wouldn't even have that.
Really?
I also got mononucleosis that tour. So it was a tour full of adversity, and since then, you know, like if I'd heard of someone last year who had a tour like that, I wouldn't have been surprised if they'd never come back.
Yeah.
But I did come back, and I built on that because as tough as that tour was, it really planted the seeds for the success that came in future tours, because the few people that did come that first year came back with friends the following year, and the few journalists that saw me that first year would write preview articles when I'd come back.
Yeah.
Sometimes the only thing that kept me afloat was the fact, you know, like emotionally afloat, was the fact that the show felt so good to do. You know, even if there was nobody in the audience, well, like 6 people in the audience, it still just felt like it's working. It's coming across, and for now, that's enough.
That's
you know?
cool.
That's all that
really
matters.
Cool. You mentioned there were cities that you did get a full house, but it was a slow build towards it. What were the things that helped you get there?
Word of mouth, absolutely.
Yeah.
For one thing, the technicians were almost always on my side. You know, I had a technically complicated show in that I always made it a priority to treat the technicians as well as I could, and they liked the show. They thought the material was good, and they always said good things about me to other technicians and to the staff. And then that would slowly bring them in. Because again, I didn't have a catchy concept. I didn't have a show that you could describe in 10 words or less. I didn't have nudity. I didn't have a sexy title. I didn't have an eye-catching poster or anything like that. So it was always a matter of just the few people that coming telling the people they knew, and word slowly getting out that I was a nice guy who was doing a good show.
That's cool. What is it about Fringe that got you addicted?
The fact that you can do whatever you want.
Yeah.
And growing up, some of my heroes had always been the Marx Brothers. And one of the things, I used to watch this documentary about them before opening nights for inspiration. It's called Marx Brothers in a Nutshell. And one of the things that was said was that there wasn't a single performance. You know, they would do shows on Broadway before they were making it as movie stars. Groucho would add new one-liners every single show. Like, nobody could write for Harpo. They would write something like Harpo does something funny. You know, he would come up with all his own material. And those were my heroes. Those were guys that did their own thing, even though they hadn't written the script. They never wrote their own scripts, but they would add to them. And they would make them original and unique and different every time. And that seemed really exciting. And that still, to me, seems like the thing that theater has going for it over other media. You know, like, so eventually I found, like, I want to say my own stuff, you know? And then discovering the works of Daniel McIver, that was another one. Daniel McIver and Spalding Gray, those were 2 really big inspirations. They were both guys that did one-man shows, which I don't think I'd ever heard of before I got exposed to their stuff. Spalding Gray's were always autobiographical, just him sitting, describing his life. Daniel McIver's were a bit more abstract, but still, it was one guy on stage, doing something original, doing something that was his, cultivating his own voice. And it was a while before I realized that's what I wanted to do. Now, I had no training as a writer, and I'd never had an ambition to see that all across Canada, for 2 weeks a year, in all these cities, people flocked to see new, unpublished, experimental, original theater. And I just thought, given that that's what I want to do, that just makes sense that that's a place that I could do that.
Yeah.
So once I started doing it, even though it was difficult that first year, I started to establish a reputation, and that just made sense to come back and keep building on that reputation, which is what I'm still doing.
That's cool. That's really cool. Yeah. What advice would you give someone who's interested in getting into Fringe and theater?
I would say do a Fringe near you, if there's one in your city. If you, it depends on what you want to do, if you want to be a writer, a director, a performer, then come up with a play and do it at one festival. And do it at the festival that's closest to you so that your traveling expenses are as low as possible, and see how it goes. And if it goes incredibly well, then think about touring it. If it goes okay, then think about doing another one in that same city before you hit the road. Just do the show again and again and again, but only hit the road once you're confident with it. My first 2 shows I didn't tour because they weren't good enough, and I'm very glad I didn't, because I've seen other people do that. Hit the road with their first show, and then the critics trash it, and then no audience members come, and then they're broke, and they're miserable, and they're tired, and they're jealous.